The automatic doors at Walmart opened with that familiar whoosh, and I stepped into the fluorescent brightness of the store on Hilliard Rome Road. It was just after 6 o'clock on a gray Thursday evening in early March, and the cold wind that had pushed a loose shopping cart across the parking lot still clung to my jacket as I walked inside. The store smelled like floor cleaner and warm rotisserie chicken, that peculiar combination that somehow feels both institutional and comforting at the same time. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at Grant Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, where I worked as a nurse on the cardiac floor, and my feet throbbed with every step I took. Anyone who has spent time in a hospital knows that those kinds of shifts can wring the life right out of you, leaving you feeling hollowed out and desperate for the simple pleasures of home. That particular day had been especially brutal. One patient had coded just before lunch, sending the entire floor into controlled chaos as doctors and nurses scrambled to save a life that hung by a thread. Another patient's family had spent nearly an hour arguing in the hallway about life support, their voices rising and falling in that terrible rhythm of grief and disagreement that makes everyone nearby feel like an intruder in someone else's tragedy. By the time my shift finally ended, my feet felt like I had walked to Kentucky and back, and all I wanted was to go home, heat up some leftover chili, and sit in my recliner with my shoes off and my golden retriever, Molly, at my feet. But I still needed groceries. The refrigerator at home held nothing but condiments and wilting lettuce, and I knew that if I didn't stop now, I would end up eating crackers for dinner 3 nights in a row. So I pulled into the Walmart parking lot, found a space near the garden center, and headed inside with a small list in my mind. Milk, eggs, a loaf of wheat bread, some canned soup for quick dinners during the week, and dog treats for Molly, who always greeted me at the door like I had been gone for a year instead of 12 hours. The store was relatively quiet for that time of evening, the after-work rush having already subsided into the slower rhythm of early evening shoppers. I moved through the aisles on autopilot, my tired brain barely registering the choices I was making. I grabbed a carton of eggs, checked the expiration date out of habit, and placed it carefully in my basket. I picked up a half-gallon of milk, some bread, a few cans of vegetable soup, and a bunch of bananas that were just the right amount of yellow. 15 minutes later, I was standing in line at register 6, third in line behind a young dad with 2 little kids hanging off the sides of his cart, and a college kid buying ramen noodles and frozen pizza in quantities that suggested either extreme budget constraints or a complete lack of culinary ambition. The woman standing directly in front of me caught my attention almost immediately, though I couldn't have said exactly why at first. She was somewhere in her late 60s or early 70s, with gray hair pulled back neatly in a low bun and a posture that suggested someone who had spent most of her life carrying herself with intention and care. Her coat was navy blue wool, the kind of classic style that people used to wear more often 20 or 30 years ago, before athletic wear became acceptable public attire and people stopped dressing up to leave the house. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, nothing that drew the eye in any particular way, just a sense of quiet composure that felt almost old-fashioned in its dignity. Her groceries were equally modest. A carton of eggs, a half-gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a couple of cans of vegetable soup, and some bananas. The kind of groceries that suggest someone lives alone or cooks simple meals for one. The kind of shopping trip that speaks to routine and practicality rather than abundance or indulgence. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with a name tag that read Linda, rang everything up with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this same motion thousands of times. "Your total is $52.13, Linda said, her voice flat but not unkind. The woman in front of me reached into her purse and pulled out a debit card, sliding it into the machine with the practiced ease of someone who had done this countless times before. We waited. The little screen blinked. Then it beeped, a short, sharp sound that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the store. Declined. Linda frowned politely, the kind of frown that suggested she had seen this happen many times before and knew better than to make a big deal of it. "Would you like to try again?" she asked. The woman's cheeks turned a shade pinker, a flush of embarrassment that she quickly tried to suppress. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice steady but with a slight tremor underneath. She pulled the card out and inserted it again, more slowly this time, as if the problem might have been her technique rather than the card itself. Same result. Declined. The word on the screen felt like a verdict, a public judgment that everyone in line could witness. I watched the woman take a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly. She didn't complain. She didn't argue. She didn't sigh loudly or make excuses or ask to speak to a manager, the way some customers do when things don't go their way. Instead, she did something that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. She began picking up her groceries one by one and placing them to the side, on the little shelf beside the register where people sometimes put things they've decided not to buy. "Well," she said softly, almost to herself, "I suppose I don't need everything tonight." First the bananas went, then one can of soup, then the milk. Her movements were careful and deliberate, the movements of someone trying to make a difficult situation easier for everyone around her. Linda the cashier looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between the woman and the growing pile of rejected items. "I can suspend the order if you want to call your bank," she offered, clearly trying to be helpful. "Oh no," the woman said quickly, a note of forced cheerfulness in her voice. "That won't be necessary. I'll just take a few things and come back another time." She was trying to make it easier for everyone else, trying not to hold up the line, trying not to make a scene. But the truth was plain as day to anyone who was paying attention. She didn't have the money. Or at least, she didn't have access to it right now, in this moment, in this checkout line on a gray Thursday evening in a Walmart in Columbus, Ohio. And something about that moment, something about the quiet dignity of it, hit me harder than I expected it to. Maybe it was the long shift I had just finished, the emotional residue of a day spent watching people fight for their lives, and their loved ones argue about whether those lives were worth fighting for. Maybe it reminded me of my mother, who had raised me alone after my father passed away when I was 19, and who had stood in similar checkout lines more times than I could count, carefully calculating which items were necessities and which could wait until next week. Or maybe it was simply that sometimes you see a moment where kindness would cost very little, and not doing it would cost your conscience a lot more. Before I had time to overthink it, before I could talk myself out of it, or convince myself that it wasn't my place to interfere, I stepped forward. "I've got it," I said. The woman turned to look at me startled, her eyes wide with surprise and something that looked almost like alarm. "Oh no, dear," she said quickly. "That's not necessary. I couldn't possibly." "It's all right," I interrupted gently. "Really." I pulled out my card and handed it to Linda before the woman could protest any further. "Just add it to mine." Linda took my card without comment, clearly used to seeing all kinds of interactions in her line, and processed the payment for both orders together. The receipt printed with a soft whir. The woman stood there for a second like she wasn't sure what to say, her hands hovering uncertainly over her few bags of groceries. Then she met my eyes, and I saw gratitude there, but also embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." I shrugged, trying to make it seem like no big deal, because the truth was that to me it wasn't a big deal. It was just $52. It was a stranger in a grocery line. It was a small thing I could do that might make someone's day a little less difficult. "Long day," I said. "Feels good to do one decent thing." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested she wasn't used to accepting help, that it went against some deeply held belief in self-sufficiency. I picked up my own bag before the conversation could stretch any longer, because sometimes the best kindness is the kind that doesn't linger, the kind that doesn't make the recipient feel obligated or studied or pitied. I nodded at her and headed toward the exit, the automatic doors opening with that familiar whoosh again. The cold air hit my face as I walked out into the parking lot, and I loaded my groceries into my car and drove home, the whole interaction already starting to fade into the background of my day. By the time I got to my driveway and saw Molly's face in the front window, her tail wagging with the pure unfiltered joy that only a dog can express, the whole thing had already started to feel like a dream, one of those small moments that drift past in the flow of everyday life without leaving much of a mark. Just one small moment. $52. A stranger in a grocery line. I assumed I would never see her again. I assumed that the interaction would remain a brief footnote in the story of my life, one of those countless anonymous encounters that happen every day, and are forgotten almost as quickly. But life has a funny way of circling back, of bringing people together in ways you could never predict. And 3 weeks later, standing at the front door of the Whitaker estate outside Cincinnati, I would hear my fiancé say words that made my heart skip a beat and brought that quiet moment in a Walmart checkout line rushing back with stunning clarity. Because the woman whose groceries I had paid for was about to become my future mother-in-law, and the story I thought I understood was about to become far more complicated than I could have imagined. 3 weeks after that Thursday evening at Walmart, I found myself standing on the wide front steps of a house that could only be described as an estate, clutching a small casserole dish of homemade baked ziti like some kind of shield against whatever lay behind the tall wooden door in front of me. Daniel, my boyfriend of nearly a year, stood beside me, looking handsome and calm in a way that made me both grateful and irritated. He had suggested this visit to his parents' home outside Cincinnati with the casual tone of someone asking about weekend plans, as if meeting the parents was something I should be looking forward to rather than something that made my stomach twist into knots every time I thought about it. "You'll like them," he had said more than once. "They're good people." That phrase, good people, can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it means kind and welcoming. Sometimes it means polite but distant. And sometimes it means people who expect you to prove you belong, who measure you against some invisible standard you can't see and aren't sure you can meet. I had spent most of my adult life surrounded by regular folks. Teachers, nurses, mechanics, retired factory workers, people who worked hard for what they had and didn't care how fancy your shoes were as long as you showed up when someone needed help. My father had worked at a tool and die shop in Newark, Ohio, until the plant closed in the early 2000s, and my mother had worked the front desk at a dentist's office for 30 years. We weren't poor exactly, but there wasn't much extra. Vacations were usually a rented cabin at Buckeye Lake. Christmas meant careful budgeting, and if something broke, you tried to fix it before replacing it. After my dad passed away when I was 19, my mom and I had leaned on each other even harder, and that experience was part of what had driven me to become a nurse. Hospitals had been part of our life during those final months of my father's illness, and I had watched nurses treat my dad with dignity when he had almost none left physically. That had mattered. It had stuck with me. It had shaped the kind of person I wanted to be. Daniel Whitaker came from a very different world. We had met, improbably enough, at a hardware store in Columbus. I had stopped by after work one evening to pick up a replacement shower head, my old one having started spraying sideways like a lawn sprinkler, and Daniel had been standing in the plumbing aisle staring at two different adapters like they were written in a foreign language. He looked frustrated and out of place, a tall guy in a navy button-down shirt and jeans that probably cost more than my entire outfit, clearly someone who didn't spend much time in hardware stores. "Need help?" I had asked. He had glanced over and laughed a little, a rueful sound that was immediately endearing. "I'm starting to think the plumbing industry has its own language," he had said. I had shown him which adapter he needed, and he had insisted on buying me coffee as a thank you. One coffee had turned into dinner a week later. Dinner had turned into more dinners. And before long, I had found myself dating a man whose life looked very different from mine. Daniel worked for Whitaker Development, his family's real estate company. They built office parks, apartment complexes, and shopping centers all across Ohio and had expanded into neighboring states. He never bragged about it, but you couldn't miss the signs. The watch he wore cost more than my monthly rent. Restaurant hosts seemed to recognize him and usher us to the best tables. And eventually, the stories about his parents had started to emerge. His father had started the business in the late 1970s with one small commercial building. By the time Daniel was born, Whitaker Development had projects in 3 states. By the time I met him, they had enough money that people sometimes lowered their voices a little when they said the family name, the way people do when they're talking about wealth and power and influence. The first time Daniel had mentioned meeting his parents, I had felt my stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Now, standing on the front steps of their house, that feeling had intensified into something close to panic. The house, if you could even call it that, was more like a stone estate, the kind of place you expect to see in a magazine about architecture or a period drama about wealthy families with complicated histories. Tall windows reflected the late afternoon light. A wide front porch stretched across the entire front of the house. The landscaping was perfect, every shrub and flower placed with intention. The driveway curved past a fountain before stopping near the front steps, and I had a sudden, irrational image of myself tripping and falling face first into the water, emerging wet and humiliated to meet my future in-laws. Daniel parked the car and turned to me with a reassuring smile. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I replied, which was about as honest as I could be under the circumstances. We walked up the steps together. He reached for the doorbell. Inside, I heard faint footsteps, measured and unhurried. Then the door opened. Daniel smiled at whoever was standing inside, and I braced myself for introductions. "Mom," he said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Emily." And then, almost as an afterthought, with a note of something I couldn't quite identify in his voice, he added, "You've met her before." I felt my stomach drop like a stone in a well. I remember the way the hallway light fell across the marble floor, the smell of lemon polish in the air, and the way a familiar voice said quietly from the living room, "Oh, it's you." And suddenly, I knew exactly who was standing there. The woman from Walmart, the one whose groceries I had paid for, the one whose card had declined, the one who had quietly begun putting food back on the conveyor belt like she was trying to disappear. Daniel's mother. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman standing in front of me was the same woman I had encountered 3 weeks earlier, of that I was certain. Same gray hair pulled back neatly, same composed posture, same gentle eyes that had looked at me across a checkout counter with gratitude and embarrassment. But the context made no sense. In my memory, she had been a woman who couldn't afford $52 worth of groceries. She had stood in a Walmart checkout line and removed items one by one because her card had been declined. And now she was standing inside one of the largest homes I had ever seen, a house that probably cost more than I would earn in a decade of nursing. Daniel stepped aside and smiled like everything made perfect sense. "Emily," he said, "this is my mother, Margaret Whittaker." I felt my fingers tighten around the casserole dish I was still holding, the baked ziti suddenly feeling like a very inadequate offering. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Margaret Whittaker walked forward, her movements graceful and unhurried. She looked directly at me, and I could tell she recognized me instantly. A faint smile touched her lips. "Well," she said quietly, "this is quite a surprise." My mind was racing. The Walmart line, the declined card, the groceries, the $52. None of it made sense in the context of this house. I managed to find my voice. "I didn't realize." I started and then stopped because I wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. Daniel glanced between us, confused. "You two really did meet?" Margaret nodded gently. "Yes," she said, "we did." Her voice carried the same calm dignity it had that night at Walmart, but standing there in that elegant foyer, the memory suddenly felt very different. Because the question pounding in my mind was simple and insistent. Why would a woman who lived in a house like this have her card declined buying groceries? Was it some kind of mistake? A technical error? Or was it something else entirely? Margaret stepped forward and reached for the casserole dish in my hands. "Let me take that," she said warmly. "You didn't need to bring anything." "It's just baked ziti," I replied, still trying to steady myself. "My mom's recipe. That sounds wonderful." She carried it toward the kitchen, and Daniel closed the door behind us. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said softly. "I might have," I replied. He laughed, clearly thinking I was exaggerating. "What happened at Walmart?" "Mom's card declined," I said, my voice flat. Daniel blinked. "What?" "She was buying groceries. The total was $52. When the card didn't work, she started putting the food back." His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You paid?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. Daniel leaned back against the wall and laughed under his breath, a sound of disbelief and amusement. "Well," he said, "that's one way to meet the family." "I feel like I stepped into the wrong story," I said. He shook his head. "No, you stepped into the right one, just not the one you were expecting." Just then, Margaret returned from the kitchen. Her expression had softened. "Dinner will be ready shortly," she said. "Why don't we sit in the living room for a moment?" I followed her and Daniel into a room that looked like something out of a design magazine. Tall windows overlooked a garden that was probably spectacular in full bloom. Leather chairs were arranged around a coffee table. Bookshelves filled with hardbound volumes lined the walls. A fireplace large enough to warm an entire cabin dominated one side of the room. Margaret sat across from me while Daniel poured iced tea from a crystal pitcher. For a moment, the three of us simply settled into our chairs. Then Margaret spoke. "I must admit," she said gently, "I never expected to see you again." "Neither did I replied. Daniel looked curious. "Mom, what exactly happened?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Well, Daniel, I went to Walmart for a few groceries. When I reached the register, my card didn't work." She glanced at me. "Your fiancé stepped forward and paid for everything without making a fuss." Daniel smiled proudly. "That sounds like Emily." I felt my cheeks warm. "It wasn't a big deal." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps not to you," she said, "but kindness rarely feels small to the person receiving it." Her tone wasn't dramatic, just honest. Still, something in the room felt slightly tense. Not hostile, but thoughtful, like everyone was quietly examining the moment from a different angle. Daniel stood up. "I'll check on Dad," he said. "He's probably in the study." Once he disappeared down the hallway, the room grew quiet again. Margaret looked at me carefully. "You must have been surprised tonight." "That's an understatement." She smiled faintly. "I imagine you have questions." I hesitated. The truth was, I had a lot of questions, but I wasn't sure how many of them were appropriate to ask. "I just didn't expect someone who lives here to have trouble buying groceries," I said finally. Margaret nodded slowly. "That's fair." She looked toward the window, thoughtful. "You see, Emily, wealth has a curious effect on the way people behave around you." I wasn't sure what she meant yet. "When people know who you are," she continued, "they treat you differently, sometimes better than they should." She looked back at me. "Sometimes they treat you worse." Her words hung quietly in the air. "So occasionally," she said, "I go places where no one knows my name, like Walmart." "Yes," I said slowly, "to see how the world feels when people believe you're ordinary." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Does that happen often?" I asked. Margaret smiled slightly. "More than you might think." Daniel returned a moment later with his father, Robert Whittaker, a tall man with silver hair and the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent decades making business decisions. Dinner followed shortly after. The meal itself was warm and pleasant. Conversation flowed about Daniel's work, stories about my nursing job, and questions about hospital life. Robert asked thoughtful questions about the cardiac floor and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. Margaret listened more than she spoke, but every once in a while, our eyes met across the table, and I couldn't help wondering something. Was that moment at Walmart truly just coincidence? Or had I walked into something more complicated than I realized? Because sometimes in wealthy families, even the smallest moments can become quiet tests of character. And I had a strange feeling that my $52 grocery purchase might mean more to them than I understood. If you've lived long enough, you learn there are two kinds of silence. There's the comfortable kind, the kind that settles over a kitchen table after supper when everybody knows each other well enough not to fill every second with words. And then there's the other kind, the kind that feels polished, careful, measured. That was the kind of silence I felt at the Whittakers' dinner table that night. Nothing was openly wrong. No one was rude. The food was excellent. The china looked old and expensive. And Robert Whittaker asked me about the hospital in the same even tone a man might use discussing the weather or a board meeting. But underneath all that civility, I felt something else. Attention. I had the strange sense that I was being observed from several angles at once. Not like prey exactly, but like a person being quietly sized up. Margaret's face gave little away. She asked about my mother. She asked where I grew up. She asked how long I had worked in cardiac care. All reasonable questions, good questions even. Still, each answer felt like it carried more weight than it should have. At one point, Robert buttered a dinner roll and said, "Nursing takes a certain stamina. Not everyone is built for that kind of work." "I suppose that's true," I said. "What drew you to it?" I took a sip of water before answering. "My father was sick for a while before he died. The nurses who cared for him made a hard situation feel a little less frightening. I never forgot that." Robert nodded. "That makes sense." Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I thought I saw something soften in her expression. Dinner moved along without incident. Daniel told a story about a contractor who had accidentally ordered the wrong roofing material for an apartment complex near Dayton. Robert laughed. Margaret shook her head and said, "That's what happens when people stop reading details." We moved on to coffee in the sitting room after dessert. By then, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and I was ready to leave. Not because the evening had gone badly, but because it felt like holding a smile too long. My cheeks were tired, my posture was tired, and my mind kept circling back to Walmart. That card, that moment, that house. When Margaret left the room to take a call and Robert stepped into his study, Daniel walked me toward the hall near the front door. "You're doing great," he said quietly. "Am I?" He smiled. "You are." I lowered my voice. "Your mother shops at Walmart in secret." He let out a breath through his nose. "Well, yes and no. What does that mean?" Daniel leaned against the wall, slipped one hand into his pocket, and looked suddenly less like the calm man who had reassured me on the drive down and more like a son who knew his family's odd habits too well. "My mother has this belief," he said. "She says that money changes how people behave. She says wealth is useful, but it creates fog. People either flatter you, resent you, or assume things about you before they know you. That doesn't really answer the question." He nodded. "Sometimes she goes out without using any account people would recognize. No driver, no assistant, no store manager fussing over her. She likes seeing people as they are." I stared at him. And what exactly was I supposed to be in that situation? "You weren't supposed to be anything, Emily." He straightened up a little. "I'm serious. My mother does this because she hates being handled. She likes ordinary places, ordinary conversations." That sounded very noble, I thought, trying to keep my tone even. But it also sounded a little like she was studying people. He went quiet. That silence answered more than his words could have. I folded my arms. "So what was Walmart, some kind of character test?" His face changed. Not angry, not defensive, uncomfortable. "No," he said at last. "Not exactly. Not exactly is not very comforting." He looked toward the living room and then back at me. "My parents have seen people get close to this family for the wrong reasons." There it was. The thing underneath the polished surface, the old fear, the suspicion. I felt my chest tighten. "And they think I might be one of those people." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "That's not what I said." "No," I replied. "It's just what you meant." "Emily, listen to me." His voice was urgent. "I paid for your mother's groceries because her card declined. I didn't even know her name. I didn't know she lived in a house with a fountain in the driveway, and somehow I'm standing here feeling like I was graded on a test I didn't know I was taking." His expression softened. "That's not fair." "No," I said quietly. "It really isn't." For the first time that night, I wanted to leave immediately. Not dramatically, not in tears, just leave. Go back to my little condo in Columbus, put on sweatpants, and sit with Molly while the whole evening shrank back down to its actual size. Daniel reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I wasn't trying to punish him. I just needed room. At that moment, Margaret reappeared at the far end of the hall. She paused for half a breath, just enough to know she had sensed tension. "Everything all right?" she asked. Daniel answered too quickly. "Fine." I said nothing. Margaret's eyes moved from him to me. She had the kind of face that revealed very little unless she wanted it to, but I could tell she understood more than either of us had said aloud. "Coffee is ready," she said gently. "I think we should head back to Columbus," I replied. Daniel turned to me. "Emily, it's a long drive," I said, "and I have an early shift." That part was true. I did have rounds at the hospital the next morning, but it wasn't the reason I was leaving. Margaret nodded slowly. "Of course." Her politeness only made me feel worse. Not because she was unkind, but because she was too composed, too impossible to read. I thanked Robert for dinner. I thanked Margaret for having me. She walked us to the door, and just before I stepped outside, she said quietly, "I hope tonight didn't feel unwelcoming." I looked at her. I could have lied, could have smoothed it over and played the pleasant guest, but I was too tired for that. "It felt complicated," I said. Something flickered in her expression. Then recognition, perhaps, of something she hadn't expected me to say. "I see," she said softly. Drive back to Columbus was mostly quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes on the dark highway ahead. Street lights flashed across the windshield in steady intervals. After 15 minutes, he said, "You think my family set you up. I think your family is so used to having money that they don't realize how humiliating it feels to wonder whether your decency is being measured. That's not what happened." "Then what did happen?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "My mother worries about whether people love us for who we are or what we can offer." I turned toward the window. "And I worry whether rich people ever really believe someone like me belongs in their world." That landed between us with more force than I intended. Daniel didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I hate that you feel that way." I hate that I had a reason to. By the time we reached my condo, I was emotionally exhausted. He parked, but neither of us moved to get out. The dashboard clock glowed 11:07. Daniel looked at me. "I love you," he said. I believed him. That was the hardest part, because love doesn't always protect you from pride or class or family history. Sometimes it drops you right into the middle of all three. "I love you too," I said, "but tonight made me feel small." His face tightened. "I'm sorry." I nodded, but I wasn't ready to forgive something I didn't yet understand. Inside, Molly greeted me in a whirl of fur and paws. I knelt and scratched behind her ears, breathing in the warm, familiar smell of dog and home. The condo was quiet, ordinary, mine. And as I stood in my own kitchen filling Molly's water bowl, I found myself thinking something I didn't want to admit out loud. Maybe the Whittakers hadn't intended to insult me. Maybe Margaret Whittaker truly had been embarrassed at Walmart. Maybe none of it had been staged. But intention and impact are two different things. And whether she meant to or not, Margaret had awakened something old and sore in me. The part that remembered every moment growing up when money entered the room before I did. The part that knew what it felt like to be looked at politely and still somehow not be fully welcomed. I went to bed that night with my mind restless and my heart defensive. And by morning, I wasn't sure whether I was angry at Margaret Whittaker or at all the years behind her that had taught me to expect exactly this. I barely slept that night, not because Daniel and I had raised our voices. We hadn't. Not because anyone had insulted me openly. They hadn't. It was worse than that. Everything had stayed polite enough to be denied. That polished kind of discomfort can keep a person awake far longer than a simple argument ever could. I kept replaying the evening in pieces. Margaret's face in the foyer. Daniel saying, "You've met her before." The look on his face in the hallway when I asked whether Walmart had been some kind of test. The pause before he answered. And then my own reaction, sharp and defensive, though if I was honest with myself, the anger had not been born that evening. It had simply been awakened. The next morning, I went to work tired and out of sorts. At the hospital, there's not much room for private turmoil. Sick hearts don't wait for your feelings to settle. Medications still need to be checked. Charts reviewed. Oxygen adjusted. Family questions answered. That helped in a way. A man in room 412 had gone into atrial fibrillation overnight, and his daughter wanted clear answers nobody could fully give yet. A woman recovering from bypass surgery needed help sitting up and was determined to pretend she didn't need any assistance at all. Real life, immediate and physical, has a way of dragging you out of your own head. Still, every quiet moment brought me back to the same question. Had Margaret Whittaker truly been embarrassed at Walmart? Or had I been part of a story already in progress? A quiet little morality play arranged by wealthy people who wanted reassurance that the world still contained decency. By noon, I had a headache sitting right behind my eyes. Daniel texted once around lunchtime. "Can we talk tonight?" I looked at the message for a long time before replying. "Long shift, maybe tomorrow." That was true, though not entirely. What I really meant was, "I'm not ready to hear your defense of your family just yet." He sent back only, "Okay, I love you." That made me feel guilty, which irritated me further. The shift ended around 7. I stopped at a Kroger near home for salad mix and chicken broth, then drove back to my condo under a low gray sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Molly met me at the door with the solemn enthusiasm only a golden retriever can manage. Tail going, eyes bright, body full of forgiveness for the fact that I had left her all day. I changed into sweatpants, fed her, heated up some soup, and was halfway through it when the doorbell rang. First, I thought it might be Daniel, but when I looked through the peephole, it wasn't him. It was Margaret Whittaker. For a second, I simply stood there staring. She wore a camel-colored coat and held both hands loosely in front of her. No handbag worth a month's rent, no dramatic jewelry, no chauffeur visible through the glass storm door, just Margaret standing on my front step like any ordinary visitor. I opened the door, but only halfway. "Mrs. Whittaker." "Margaret, please," she said. "I hope I'm not intruding." I hesitated. "I didn't know you had my address." "Daniel gave it to me this afternoon. I told him I wanted to speak with you alone, and to his credit, he thought that was probably best." There was something almost dry in her tone. I stepped back and let her in. My condo was modest. Living room, small dining area, galley kitchen, narrow hallway. Nothing in it had ever appeared in a magazine, but it was clean and warm and fully paid for. Only in the sense that I paid for it every single month. Margaret looked around, not critically, just quietly taking it in. Molly approached and leaned against her leg. Margaret smiled and bent to scratch behind her ears. "Well," she said, "at least someone here is willing to trust me." That disarmed me more than it should have. I motioned toward the couch. "Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you, I won't stay long." We sat facing each other, my coffee mug still warm in my hands. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked directly at me. "I owe you an apology." I hadn't expected that. "For what?" I asked. "For an evening that left you feeling measured instead of welcomed." I stayed quiet. She continued. "I saw it in your face before you left, and I heard enough in the hallway to understand at least part of the misunderstanding." I set my mug down. With respect, it wasn't hard to misunderstand. "No," she said. "It wasn't." That answer caught me off guard. I had expected self-justification, maybe polished reasoning, not agreement. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Emily, the incident at Walmart was not staged." Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. "I want to say that plainly first." I searched her face, trying to detect whether this was the polished truth or the actual one. She seemed to understand that. "You don't know me well enough yet to trust my word," she said. "That's fair, but I'll tell you exactly what happened." She took a slow breath. 3 days before that shopping trip, my handbag was stolen from my car while I was at the garden center. It was my fault, really. I set it down in the passenger seat and forgot to lock the door. By the time I realized it, the credit cards were already being used. I said nothing, but I felt myself lean in slightly. I canceled everything that afternoon. Every card, every account tied to that wallet. My assistant later arranged replacements, but one old debit card was still in my coat pocket from a prior trip. I forgot it had already been deactivated. She gave a faint, rueful smile. "So when I stopped at Walmart on the way home and tried to use it, I was not making a social experiment of the checkout lane. I was simply a woman with the wrong card and a very embarrassing lapse in memory." That was so specific. It rang true in the way lies usually don't. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Why didn't you say that last night?" "Because dinner was not the right setting, and because," she added, "pride is not only a problem among the poor." That landed. I looked down at my hands. She went on. "When my card declined, I was embarrassed. Not because of the money itself, because I am accustomed to competence. I'm used to handling things. And there I was, unable to buy soup and bread like any ordinary person." I thought back to the checkout lane. How quickly she had begun removing items. How carefully she had tried not to inconvenience anyone else. It had not looked theatrical. It had looked familiar, like someone trying to hold on to dignity. Margaret's voice softened. "What mattered to me wasn't only that you paid. It was how you did it quietly, without performance, without lingering for praise. You spared me the humiliation of being turned into a lesson in someone else's generosity." That pierced me a little because she was right. There are people who help in a way that keeps the other person indebted. I had seen that too all my life. "I didn't want to embarrass you," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I remembered you." We sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the question that still mattered. "But Daniel said you sometimes go places where nobody knows who you are." Margaret nodded. "I do. That sounds a lot like testing people." "It can look that way," she admitted. "And perhaps sometimes, if I am not careful, it becomes too close to it. Wealth can make a person suspicious. You begin to wonder whether people see you or merely your circumstances." I crossed my arms, though not as defensively as before. "And people without money wonder the same thing in reverse." A shadow of understanding moved across her face. "Yes," she said. "I think that may be exactly what happened between us." The room was quiet except for Molly shifting on the rug. Margaret leaned back slightly, studying me with more openness than she had shown the night before. "Daniel loves you," she said. I looked away for a second. "I know. He has loved other women before, nice enough women, impressive women, but never with this much steadiness." She paused. "That matters to a mother." I didn't know what to say to that. She continued. "And before I ever knew you were the woman he intended to marry, I already knew one thing. When faced with a small, private choice, you chose kindness." I swallowed hard. "That doesn't make me a saint." "I should hope not," she said, and to my surprise, I almost laughed. Then her expression grew serious again. "Emily, I am sorry that our family's history and caution made you feel judged. I cannot promise my husband and I are free from old assumptions. We are not. but I would rather correct a misunderstanding now than let it harden into resentment. That word, resentment, struck me because it was exactly what had begun forming in me. Slowly, against my own resistance, the hard knot inside my chest began to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen. "I appreciate you coming here," I said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," she smiled faintly. "That would have been understandable." I studied her face. She looked elegant, yes. Composed, yes. But suddenly, she also looked older than she had the night before. Not weak, just human. A woman shaped by decades of carrying herself in a certain way. I thought of my own mother and how quickly dignity can become armor when life has humbled you enough times. "So it really was just the wrong card," I said. "It really was. And Walmart wasn't some test. No, though perhaps life has a way of turning accidents into revelations." That was a very Margaret Whittaker sentence, if ever there was one. I smiled despite myself. And she stood to leave. I walked her to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, "I liked you before I knew who you were." There was no polish in that moment, no performance. Just an older woman offering truth in the simplest way she knew how. After she left, I stood by the door for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft click of Molly's nails on the floor as she came to stand beside me. The misunderstanding hadn't vanished entirely. There were still deeper things underneath it. Class, pride, old fears, Daniel caught in the middle of worlds. But one thing had changed. The story I had told myself about Margaret Whittaker was no longer clean enough to be comforting. And when our neat explanations begin to crack, that is often when the real truth finally gets room to breathe. After Margaret left that night, the condo felt strangely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the thoughtful kind, the kind that makes you realize the story in your head might not be the whole story. Molly had curled up beside the couch, her tail occasionally thumping the floor as if she were reminding me the world still contained simple loyalties. I sat there a long time replaying Margaret's words. "Pride is not only a problem among the poor." That line stayed with me because if I was honest, some of the anger I had felt toward her family hadn't been about them at all. It had been about history. The long shadow of growing up in a place where money always seemed to arrive in the room before respect did. But the next conversation I needed to have wasn't with Margaret. It was with Daniel. The following evening, he came by after work. He looked tired, the way people do when they've spent the day worrying about something they can't quite fix. When I opened the door, Molly greeted him like a returning war hero. Daniel scratched behind her ears and gave me a cautious smile. "Hi, hi." We stood there for a moment before he stepped inside. The condo suddenly felt very small for a conversation this big. "Did my mother come by?" he asked. "Yes." I motioned toward the couch. "Sit." He did. I remained standing for a moment before finally taking the chair opposite him. "She explained what happened with the card." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Good. It really was canceled." "Yes, that would have been nice to know before dinner." He nodded. "You're right." His willingness to admit that softened something in me. "I thought your family was testing me," I said. "I know you did. Can you blame me?" "No," he replied. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Emily, my parents have spent 40 years building a business. Along the way, they've met people who wanted to be close to that business for the wrong reasons." "I understand that," I said. "But understanding something and feeling judged by it are two different things." He looked down at his hands. "That's true," Daniel continued. "My mother grew up hearing stories from my grandparents about the Great Depression. My grandfather lost his farm in Kentucky in 1932. For a while, the family lived in a converted barn." I looked up. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't," Daniel said. "By the time I was born, my father had already built the company, but my mother never forgot those stories. That explains why she shops at Walmart partly and why she worries about money changing people." "Yes," he watched me carefully, "but there's another part of this we should talk about." "What's that?" "You." I raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" "You've carried something into this relationship, too." I crossed my arms. "Such as?" "A belief that wealthy people are always waiting to judge you." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. Because the truth was, he wasn't entirely wrong. "That belief didn't come from nowhere," I said. "I know. My dad worked 30 years in a factory that shut down anyway. I watched my mother count grocery money at the kitchen table more times than I can remember. When people with money talked about hard work, it didn't always feel like they understood what that meant." Daniel listened quietly. I've seen both sides of that, he said. My parents worked incredibly hard, but I also know luck plays a role people don't like to admit. The honesty in that surprised me. I guess what I'm saying, he continued, is that you and my mother are actually worried about the same thing. And what's that? That money can distort the way people see each other. I sat back in the chair. That thought settled into the room like a piece of furniture that had always belonged there. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said quietly, I felt small at that dinner. Daniel nodded. I know, and that feeling goes back a long way. I know that too. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small patch of grass behind the condo. My father sometimes says wealth is like wearing a heavy coat. It protects you from certain storms, but it also makes people assume things about you before you open your mouth. I thought about Margaret standing in the Walmart checkout line, quietly removing bananas from the counter. Maybe that had been the coat slipping off for a moment. I don't want to be someone who's always on guard around your family, I said. You don't have to be, but I also don't want to pretend class differences don't exist. Daniel turned back toward me. Neither do I, he walked over and sat beside me. Emily, the reason I love you isn't because you impressed my parents. I hope not. It's because you're steady. You don't pretend to be something you're not. And when a stranger needed help buying groceries, you stepped forward without making it a spectacle. That was $52, I said. It wasn't about the amount. Sat quietly together. Molly lifted her head and looked between us like she was supervising the entire conversation. Daniel reached for my hand. This time I didn't pull away. My mother respects you, he said. She barely knows me. She knows enough. I considered that. Maybe respect didn't always come from long familiarity. Sometimes it came from a single moment when no one expected anything from you. There's still something we haven't talked about, I said. What's that? Your father. Daniel chuckled softly. Dad respects practical people. If you work hard and tell the truth, you're already halfway there. That sounds manageable. It is. I squeezed his hand. And Daniel, yeah, if your mother ever runs into trouble at Walmart again, she should probably carry a backup card. He laughed. Noted. The tension in the room finally loosened. Not disappeared completely, but loosened enough to breathe. Later that evening, we walked Molly around the block together. The spring air was cool and smelled faintly of wet pavement and budding trees. Street lights flickered on one by one as the sky darkened. Halfway down the sidewalk, Daniel said something that stayed with me. You know what my mother told me after she met you at Walmart? What? She said that young woman helped someone who couldn't repay her. That's the kind of person who builds a life worth sharing. I looked up at him. She said that? She did. The sidewalk stretched ahead of us in quiet rows of houses and porch lights. For the first time since the dinner in Cincinnati, the future didn't feel like a test. It felt like a road we were still learning how to walk together. A misunderstanding can do one of two things. It can harden into a wall, or it can become a doorway if the people involved care more about truth than pride. In the weeks after Margaret came to my condo, things changed slowly, the way most worthwhile changes do. Not with a grand speech, not with a sudden miracle, just one honest conversation at a time. Daniel and I drove back to his parents' house 2 Sundays later for lunch. This time I wasn't carrying a casserole dish like armor. I brought a lemon bundt cake and a steadier heart. The house looked the same as before, stone, polished windows, long drive curving through trimmed hedges. But it didn't feel as imposing. Maybe because now I understood that every house, no matter how large, still contains ordinary people carrying ordinary fears. Margaret greeted me at the door herself. She smiled and took the cake from my hands. I'm glad you came back, she said. So am I, that was all. No elaborate clearing of the air, no dramatic reference to Walmart, just a simple truth laid down between us like the first board in a bridge. Lunch was quieter than the first dinner, but easier. Robert asked about one of my patients who had made a remarkable recovery. I told him the story without violating any privacy, just enough to explain why some shifts leave you feeling hopeful and others leave you wrung out. Margaret asked for my mother's pound cake recipe and wrote it down in neat handwriting on a recipe card from a drawer in the kitchen. Daniel noticed the change before I did. At one point, he caught my eye across the table and gave me a small smile that said, "There you are. That's the woman I know." Spring moved into summer. Daniel and I grew closer in the plain, practical ways that matter most. arguing over paint colors for the condo we eventually planned to share, laughing over burnt garlic bread, sitting side by side on the couch while Molly snored between us. One afternoon in June, Margaret invited me to go with her to a garden center outside Cincinnati. At first, I thought it might be awkward, but it wasn't. We spent an hour choosing hydrangeas and arguing gently over whether white blooms looked classic or funeral. She had opinions about mulch, strong ones. At one point, while loading bags of potting soil into the trunk, she looked at me and said, "You know, my mother would have liked you." That meant more than she probably realized. Because for women of her generation, and mine too in some ways, approval is not always spoken in dramatic language. Often it appears in practical little sentences, wrapped in ordinary moments. By July, Daniel and I had set a wedding date for early fall. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony at a chapel near Columbus, followed by a reception at a restored community hall with string lights, simple flowers, and enough good food that nobody would leave hungry. I wanted it to feel like a real wedding, not a performance. Daniel agreed. Margaret surprised me by supporting that completely. "Large weddings are often more expensive than meaningful," she said. Robert grinned and added, "Your future mother-in-law has been waiting 30 years for someone to say that." The wedding day came bright and clear. The chapel smelled faintly of wood polish and lilies. My mother cried before the music even started. Daniel looked at me the way a man looks when he knows exactly what he is choosing. That steadied me. After the ceremony, people gathered at the hall. Plates clinked. Chairs scraped. Older relatives asked all the usual questions about future grandchildren as if they were filling out census forms. Late in the evening, after dinner but before cake, Robert stood and tapped his glass lightly. "I promised my wife I would keep this short," he said, which made everyone laugh. Then he turned to Margaret. She insisted on speaking. Margaret rose with one hand on the table. She was elegant as always, but there was a softness in her face I hadn't seen the first night I met her. She looked around the room, then at Daniel and me. "I won't embarrass the bride," she said, which earned a few chuckles. "At least not much." Then her voice grew calmer. "A few months ago, I found myself in a grocery store checkout line with the wrong card in my hand and more pride than sense. A kind woman behind me stepped forward and quietly paid for my groceries. She didn't stay to be thanked properly. She didn't ask my name. She simply helped, then walked away." The room had gone still. Margaret looked at me. "I learned later that this same woman loved my son." A few guests smiled. My mother reached for a tissue again. Margaret continued. "There are moments in life when character reveals itself without announcement, not in grand speeches, not in public achievements, but in private choices when no one is keeping score." Her eyes moved slowly across the room. "My family has been blessed with success, but success can make people forget what matters. It can blur the difference between status and worth. Emily reminded us that true worth still looks like humility, decency, and kindness offered without witness." My throat tightened. Margaret lifted her glass. "To the bride and groom, and to the kind of love that sees people clearly." Glasses rose all around the room. Mine shook a little in my hand. Later that evening, after the last dance and the last slice of cake had been wrapped for someone's drive home, I stood outside the hall under a soft Ohio night. The air was warm. Crickets sounded from the grass. Daniel had gone back inside to help his father gather gifts from the table. Margaret stepped out beside me. For a moment, we stood in silence. Then she said, "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" "That $52 could turn into a family." I smiled. "It wasn't really about the money." "No," she said. "It never was." We stood there another minute, two women from different backgrounds linked now not by suspicion, but by understanding. And I realized something I wish I'd understood earlier in life. Most people are carrying old stories. Stories about class, about pride, about what it means to belong. We hurt each other when we let those stories speak louder than the person standing in front of us. But we heal when we choose curiosity over assumption, and grace over wounded pride. That is the lesson I carried from Walmart to that wedding night. True wealth is not what sits in a bank. It is the ability to treat another human being with dignity when there is nothing to gain from it. And sometimes the smallest private kindness returns years later as something larger than you ever imagined. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when kindness changed the course of your life, or when an old misunderstanding finally gave way to grace, I hope you'll hold on to that feeling. Share it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, full of heartfelt lessons and second chances, I'd be grateful to have you along for the next one. Because no matter our age, we are all still learning how to see each other clearly.